You're listening to an election special programme here on Wickham Sound. Myself, Bob Johnson, with you, speaking to the candidates who want your vote in the Wickham constituency in the general election on Thursday, the 12th of December. It's time now to hear my interview with Peter Sims from the Green Party. I was born in Wickham Hospital. I grew up living in Lane End. I went to school both in Marlow and in Maidenhead. And I have now returned back so I'm now back living in Lane End again. I went away to university for did an electronic engineering degree at the University of Surrey, and then returned a few years ago to the place where I grew up. Okay, and what do you do for work? So I'm freelance. I do various bits of freelance work. I'm on the core group for Greenhouse Think Tank, which is a policy research organisation. They've published various reports recently. They've published a book called Facing Up Climate Reality. I've been working primarily on the climate jobs project that they've been doing for the last few years, trying to estimate what the employment change is going to be, for the transition to get to net zero, which is a very interesting bit of work. It's taken me to places like Poland and to Ireland and to present the climate jobs numbers for various different places. So that's been an interesting use of my engineering skills in a sort of systems engineering way, in a modelling context. But very interesting and very useful piece of work, I think. Okay, so when did you start getting interested in politics? Did it go way back? Is it more recent? Well, my interest in politics is very much as a necessity of the situation we find ourselves in, right? If the last few years have proved, in my mind, that both our systems of democracy are not fit for the challenges they face, but it's also proved that the current political parties don't seem to be able to respond to the challenges that we're facing today, and it's proved that we, as a civilization, really haven't got our, we've always had a failure of imagination, that we haven't been able to imagine that the situation around climate change and biodiversity loss is as bad as it is, let alone imagine what sort of change would be required to respond to it. And as a result of those things combined, I sort of have, felt that as someone who, has had very, an interest in these things for quite a long time. And I first remember, making a poster on climate change when I was back at, I think it was year 7 at secondary school. But it's developed, and it's not just climate change, it's how the social implications fit in with it. We've got to transition to avoid this, but there's no point doing it in a way that's very authoritarian, that's going to, plunge millions of people into poverty. We've got to do it in a way that enables us to create a better society. And there are loads of opportunities for this. There are lots of ways in which the solutions to climate change, although hard to implement, actually have win-wins in various ways. I'm in no way saying this is that what we've got to go through is easy, but it will do things like reduce air pollution as well as avoid. It will do things like perhaps make people improve people's quality of life by getting more exercise, but more. There's all sorts of co-benefits in lots of ways, but that doesn't mean it's not a challenge to get us there. So it sounds very much as if you're certainly not a career politician, in that you weren't at school thinking, I really want to end up in Westminster, but actually you're doing it because you feel that you've got to. I was out there speaking to people on the doorstep today, who sort of asked the same question in a sense, and I went, no, you don't. Being an MP is one of the most stressful jobs out there. Particularly in this current political climate. I don't quite understand anyone who desperately wants all that stress in their life, but ultimately it's very difficult to have an opinion and to care about what we the future of the sort of world that I'm going to grow old into, and other people are going to pass on to future generations and all the rest of it, and then you can't complain about how it's being run unless you're willing to put yourself forward to try and do it better. So that's what I'm doing. So what do you think are what's the most important issue in Wickham at the moment? In Wickham at the moment, I think it's an issue in Wickham, but I think it's an issue bigger than Wickham as well. So one of the things published, actually was on the BBC News, was a thing about the UN report that came out saying that to have a hope of meeting the 1.5 degree target, which is this abstract, what's 1.5 degrees, but that's what the international consensus is, that if we want to protect the way of life that we've come to live in Wickham and to be able to pass on the world to future generations in a better sense in a better place than it currently is, then that's what we have to limit global temperature rise to. And the report basically says to achieve that, we've got to have a 7% annual reduction in CO2 emissions year on year for a decade. And that's a really big ask. But we've got to think not in terms of that, but in terms of what does that look like in Wickham. That means in a decade, between now and 2030, we've got to have a Green New Deal, and we've got to completely transform Wickham. And that's got to be locally led. It's got to be nationally enabled. We can't do it without the funding, without the legislation, but the Green Party is very much that things should be done at the lowest possible level. We as Wickham should decide how that transformation is going to happen around us. What's the right combination of public transport and active transport and car share schemes and all the rest of it that's going to work in Wickham to allow us to get a net zero transport system? How does the food and agriculture system work out? We're big town, but with urban, rural hinterland around us. What does a local food system, what does a sustainable food system look like? How can we ensure that everyone has access to affordable but also healthy, fresh food? And how does that fit in terms of the labour? How does that fit into properly rewarding farmers for the work that they do? There's so many things about the current system that just aren't working for anyone. Farmers are being paid a pittance in a lot of sense. We have lack of we're losing our community infrastructure in terms of local shops and stuff. And how does those things fit into the wider transition? And we've got to look at that at a local level, and we've got to have a bit often the way it's done is by passing a climate emergency motion, or setting the sort of transition town approach of going, what sort of country do we want, what sort of place do we want to be in 10 years time, and what's got to change to get there. But in terms of becoming an MP, we can only do that at the local level because Britain is one of the most centralised countries in Europe, and one of the things that's in my manifesto is to try and one in the Green Party manifesto is to devolution of power in England, so that we have more control, so that local authorities can borrow to invest and to and do all the things that they need to do, have the powers they need to have to enable to make this transition. So we've got to, the reason this election, rather than the elections in May next year, which are the the local elections for the new unitary authority, the reason this election is so important is so that is because this is the last opportunity for the country to change direction and nationally to enable this change that's got to happen at a local level. So that's why I'm standing to be the MP for Wickham, is because that change has got to happen at a national level.
What about Brexit, which obviously has dominated this election? Where do you stand personally, and how did you vote in the 2016 referendum?
Okay, so I think the last few years have proved a number of very important things, and I think a lot of this was overlooked when we first started, with the original referendum. Where we are now, there are a lot of people with very well thought out, very well held views, but contradictory views, and it's not just that the people have views on two sides. People have very complex preferences around this. Some people think that a deal or one of the many deals is better than Remain, but would prefer to have Remain than no deal, and some people would prefer to have no deal rather than a deal. And it's not as simple as yes or no or one or the other. There are very complex and very emotionally charged opinions people have on this. And we've basically spent the last 3 years trying to consolidate these people into different camps and, foster resentment between them. And we've all got to live in the same country. We've all got to come to some sort of compromise of how we proceed with this. So I think actually what my personal view is, or anyone's personal view, is not the most important thing right now. We've basically wasted the last 3 years of this country's national, political debate arguing over this. And we can't waste the next 3 years. So we've got to find a way of moving forwards on this issue that everyone feels their opinion has been heard, and that we've got to start building consensus, start building compromise. And not everyone will be happy with all of it, but I think the majority of people, certainly the majority of people I spoke on the doorstep, recognise that actually, whatever their opinion, we've got to get this over with. We've got to move on. So the Green Party is proposing. I have I think there are two potential ways that we can move forward this in a way that people feel is fair and democratic. The Green Party is proposing one of them, which is another referendum, but a referendum in a completely different way to the way we did it last time. I think we need to have all the viable ways forwards on the ballot paper. So that could be at least one deal, potentially two deals, remain, but also no deal on the ballot paper. And I think we need to give people the chance to rank them and express those complex preferences about what order, what people are prepared to compromise with, what people aren't prepared to compromise with. And the other potential way forward is to have a citizens' assembly on it. It's something that has been used very effectively in Ireland to deal with a very politically contentious issue. And I think that, if we can't agree how to word a referendum, then a citizens' assembly, if nothing else, to agree the wording for, but possibly to agree the whole thing. I don't know. But we've got to think of this in terms of how can we build consensus and how can we move beyond this issue and find a way of moving forwards that people are prepared to accept, rather than continuing to be divisive over it.
How does the Citizens' Assembly, say, differ from something like the House of Commons?
So a citizens' assembly, sorry, I should clarify this, shouldn't I? So a citizens' assembly is almost like a citizens' jury. So you can have them of different sizes depending on the nature of the issue and all sorts of things. But basically, it's a load of randomly selected people, from the electoral roll, who would be, who would form this assembly with a very specific task and a very specific time frame to do that in, to decide. And obviously, because they're randomly selected, assuming that it's a few hundred people and therefore it's a big enough sample, it should perfectly be representative of all the differences in terms of race, age, ethnicity, view on our relationship with the European Union and everything else, right? And therefore, it's very, it is by definition representative of the populace, and therefore, if they can sit down in a room and decide a way that forwards, given all their their differing views, and I'm sure they'll have very many differing views when they go into it, we can't all 60 odd million, 70 odd million of us sit down in a room and argue this out in the next week, but we could give a randomly selected representatives of us, put them in a room to only address that issue and decide what they because this isn't really a political issue in the sense that it's much more an identity issue, and it's much wider than the sort of political issues around how should we nationalise the railways, or should we it's not that sort of political issue. It's a very different issue. So that would allow us to move forwards on a way in this that I think the last few years have proved that Parliament is tying itself in knots and fighting over the pernickety bits of the of its rules of how it operates to try and deal with this issue, because it isn't designed for tackling this sort of very big, divisive, complicated, emotional issue.
Moving on to a different issue, how do you think we should be tackling the increase in homelessness and also the rise in the use of food banks?
I think it's absolutely appalling that both those things are happening in a country that claims to be, that is as wealthy as we are, and claims to be civilised and all the rest of it. So I think there's a number of things that need to happen here, and I think the first thing we have to recognise is that inequality matters and social mobility matters, and both of those are probably far more important indicators of the state of our country than GDP, growth, or any of the economic indicators. If social mobility is falling, which it has been for the past few decades, and inequality is rising, which it has been for the last few decades, something is fundamentally wrong about how our society is operating. And the very visual on the street representation of that is people using food banks and people being homeless. And it is unacceptable. And there's two parts. There's the immediate, how can we, alleviate the pain and suffering as a result of these problems, but also how do we get ourselves in this mess, and how can we ensure that we don't have people who are forced into those situations, or we massively minimise the amount of people who are forced in those situations in the future. So I think the Green Party are proposing various things to respond to this. So we need to have a taxation system that explicitly aims to reduce inequality. So the Green Party is proposing a land value tax as an alternative to replace both business rates but also council tax. And land is is basically the easy to tax asset, wealth, because you can't hide land. So that is a way of basically having a wealth tax in a way that you can do and is not practically possible. And that would be a start point to try and reduce inequality. But the other thing we're proposing as the more immediate thing is to introduce universal basic income. And that would be a massive step in the direction of ensuring that no one has to sleep on the street and no one has to go to a food bank, because everyone has the right to food and shelter, and therefore everyone should have income to be able to do that. So yeah, I could go on for a while, but perhaps we don't have time for more detail.
Okay, what is your opinion of the NHS as an organisation?
I think the NHS is an excellent organisation, but I think its focus is perhaps wrong, which is one of the reasons it's been struggling to cope with pressures, particularly more recently. It has also, I think, been badly managed in the sense of the introduction of various bits of privatisation and internal competition and all these things. So I think those have made its task even more difficult than it would have otherwise been. But we have to recognise that the strain that it is being put under, given its current focus, is unsustainable. The cost is only going to increase if we carry on like we are. And I think the issue is it's too focused in terms of curing people when they become ill rather than preventing people becoming ill. And that requires a wholly different approach, right? It's not, yes, A&E and emergency services are absolutely critical, but much better if we had the right amount of support in people's day-to-day lives. So we need to integrate social care and healthcare, and we need to take a more well-being approach, I would argue. And I'm an electronic engineer by training, so I do not claim to be a healthcare specialist in any sense. But I think if we took an approach that was much more about helping people to lead happy, healthy lives and support, so currently people are put under a lot of pressure in terms of the busyness and their commitments, and having to move around lots, and being very strapped for money, which means that people often don't have time to cook properly, and they don't have time to buy food. They have to rely on fast food and this sort of thing, and that pushes people away from a healthy food culture. There's also the current poor public and active transport facilities. The number of cars on the road push people away from active transport. So by focusing on both sort of the wider changes around needed for sustainability in those sectors, that might help reduce the number of dietary related illnesses, or dietary disease, I think is the right term. And again, more people being active would help in other ways. But there are lots of examples, and I won't go into them or claim to know the detail. But it's about, from a national policy point of view, it's about the approach. Currently, the approach is very much if you get ill, we will come. The public feels that you should have free healthcare to respond to that, which is completely true. But we can make the bill of doing that a lot lower, a lot more affordable, if we spent a bit more money on trying to do the preventative thing, trying to support people in leading happy and healthy lives.
What do you feel about the grammar school system that we have here in Buckinghamshire?
So I didn't mention this earlier, but I said that I went to school in Maidenhead, which is obviously I live in Lane End, so it's obviously quite a way.
Yeah.
So why did I do that? So I'm dyslexic. I was never going to pass the 11 plus in a million years, so I chose to go out of county. Okay, I was encouraged by my parents to go out of county to go to secondary school, because the first senior school I went to was a maths and computing specialist school. That set me up very well for the engineering I went on to, so that fitted for me as well, but also it was comprehensive. So I firmly believe that in comprehensive education, I don't think a 11 via some verbal reasoning test is a very good way of classification. You know, I have a first-class degree from a university, master's degree from a university, but I wasn't clever enough to go to grammar school. It seems madness to me.
What did you feel about the recent protest by Extinction Rebellion?
The thing that I think is undeniable is that they created a political space. They moved the Overton window, if you want to use the technical term, right, around climate change, but they also brought to light the point about biodiversity loss. People have been talking about climate change for a while. We have to realise we're living through a mass extinction event. We're losing birds, animals, insect species at a rate that, at this rate, and we sort of know what the solutions to climate change are. We sort of know what we've caused, what's causing what and what we have to do. We're not saying we know entertaining is easy, but we sort of know what's going on. With biodiversity loss, there's a lot less, certainly, knowledge amongst politicians and the public, but I think there's a lot less scientific knowledge as well about exactly what combination of, is it just pesticides, or is it, is it loss of habitat, or is it probably all of these things? But we don't know quite what we'd have to do to reverse it. But yet we're reliant on these species that are going extinct, particularly insects, for things like pollination. So I think Extinction Rebellion did a very important piece of work by bringing that to the public's mind, because we could respond to climate change in a way that completely ignored the biodiversity crisis and potentially even made it worse. If we went and got rid of all the fields and woodland to cover them all in PV, so that we had enough electricity to have renewable electricity, and in the process got rid of all the biodiversity, we would just be moving the problem around and shooting ourselves in the foot, to use an acronym. I think they did a very important piece of work there, and I think it is a symptom about the fact that our current political structures have just they can't deal with a problem on the time span in terms of when the penalty for not doing anything comes in, but also of the sort of enormity and all-encompassing nature of it. And this is where the main parties fall down as well, right? So as soon as you look at climate change, I mean, I brought some grass along here, which obviously the audience can't see, but
always works well on radio.
But if you look at both the Earth system trends, whether whatever, it doesn't matter which indicator you look at, but also the economic and the social trends in terms of So I'll give you an example, like paper production, population, energy use, transportation, amount of people travel, carbon dioxide, ocean acidification, methane, forest deforestation. All of these things are all going in the same direction, and it's all that hockey stick graph, that exponential increase. And the idea that isn't linked to the exponential growth in the economy, and that somehow we can stop doing all those things and still exponentially every year consume more things, spend more money, is, in my mind, that's the point where the evidence hasn't really filtered through to the approaches of the main political parties, because all of the Labour, Lib Dems and Conservatives are all still pro-growth. They're still pro-economic growth, and the idea that is plausible in the future, long term, given well, even regardless of these threats, but certainly in the light of those threats, in my mind, is just ridiculous. I don't understand how. I mean, I can understand how the political system has got us here, but coming back to Extinction Rebellion, it's because the political system has got us here and failed to have any way of getting its head round this massive divergence between reality and everything that's spoken about in the media and what the main political parties put in their manifestos. That divergence has created the space and the need for Extinction Rebellion, because there is a growing number of people who see this blindingly clearly, this massive divergence, and go, how can things carry on as they are? What avenue do I have left?
We're nearly out of time. Last couple of questions. What do you think the role of an MP is? So
I think it's a multifaceted role. It's a complicated role, and I think it's very different to the role of a councillor, because and I think it's perhaps going to be different in the future to what it has been in the past to some degree. If the only thing that I'm certain of is that the future has to be different to the past. So what's the role of an MP? Well, it's you've got to represent the people who live locally at the national stage, in the national strategic decision making. So part of it is a communication point of thing. So it's taking the key concerns, things that from local constituents and flagging those up, raising those on the national stage where they are relevant, and that's the place to raise them. But part of it's also having a handle on these big strategic issues, and not just what the problem is. We should do something about climate change. But you've got to have we need people in Parliament who understand what's necessary to get to net zero in 2030. Even if we decide that even if the democratic consensus decides that that's not the target, if we don't have people in there that understand it and understand what that would look like and what you'd have to do to achieve that in the different sectors, then we've ruled it out per se. It's just never going to happen. If no one understands it, no, it's never going to happen, is it? So I think we need. I think there is a significant lack of. You could call it engineering understanding, or you could call it, climate change understanding. We can call it lots of different things, but an understanding of how much of a challenge getting, an annual reduction of 7% that's a very big challenge. But also understanding it's not just a technical challenge. So often it's perceived that, we've just got to swap a few cars for electric cars, or we've just got to swap a few this for that. And it's not part of it's a technical challenge, but almost that's the easy part. The hard part is taking everyone with us. The hard part is the behavioural change side of this. Because the shift in terms of how people travel, and the shift in terms of how people work, and the shift in terms of where people, in terms of how we go about things that we do at the moment, how we grow our food, how the food gets, our involvement in the food chain. There's huge amounts of things that have got to change in a way that isn't very technically difficult, but that cultural, behavioural change in norms is not going to happen without a lot of support, but also a lot of stimulus and a lot of and I think a lot of people either simplify it down to we'll have a carbon tax and that will push people and they'll do the right thing, which, well, yes, that's fine if you're middle class and can afford to just spend the money, but a lot of people can't. We can't go around assuming that everyone can just do that. Or they assume that it's all going to be about getting people to use disposable coffee cups, which you should do, but that's it's not going to be all about people making small behavioural change. It's not all going to be about a few big taxes. It's got to be the right combination of these things in parallel, and that's and balancing those two is a really quite complicated thing, and it's something that I didn't get into politics or anything to go into, but having done this work for Greenhouse Think Tank for the last few years and looking at that sort of overlap between the technical change and the behavioural change, in the climate jobs context, it's something I've sort of come to have quite a bit of knowledge about, which is perhaps why I'm offering it to the country as a service. Okay,
final question. If you are elected as MP for Wickham, would you seek a second home near Westminster, or would you continue to live where you live now?
In the context of the country, this is fairly near Westminster, really, isn't it? I commute in and out of London a bit at the moment, so I think there would be no reason not to continue doing that, no.
That's Peter Simms, who is standing as the Green Party candidate in the general election in the Wickham constituency. And that concludes my interviews with the candidates. Unfortunately, we were unable to hear from Vijay Suro, the UKIP candidate, because he was unable to find time to give us an interview. However, he did attend the roundtable discussion that we were able to broadcast with 6 of the candidates. Tony Brodel from the Liberal Democrats, unfortunately, was ill the day that we recorded that, so we were unable to hear from her, although she did give us a one-to-one interview. You can hear all of the one-to-ones and the roundtable discussions on our website. They are there at wickhamsound.org.uk. The full list of candidates who are standing for election in Wickham at the general election on the 12th of December are as follows: Khalil Ahmed for Labour, Steve Baker for the Conservatives, Tony Brodel for the Liberal Democrats, Ed Gemmell, who is an independent candidate, Peter Simms for the Greens, Vijay Suro for UKIP, and Julia Wassell for the Wickham Independents. Join me tomorrow night from 6 p.m. when I will be speaking to the candidates who are standing in the Beaconsfield constituency.